So today I am very pleased to announce that we have Lisa Johnson with us. She is a UW Extension Madison horticulture outreach specialist for Dane County, and she is going to inform us on creating a seed-saving vegetable garden. Lisa, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Tim. Is everybody able to see my screen okay?
Looks good.
All right, awesome. All right, well then let's go ahead and get started. As Tim said, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get going here. All right, so saving seeds is something that can be a really fun activity, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. So the first things that we're going to do here is talk about kind of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So we need to talk about pollination because it's really important to understand how pollination occurs and which types of pollination are helpful to you as a seed saver and which ones maybe not so much. Then we'll talk about how seeds form. I'll give you a few terms. And then we'll talk about what crops actually work best for seed saving and some techniques that you can use to prevent cross-pollination. We're trying to prevent cross-pollination because cross-pollination creates a lot of genetic diversity. And when you're saving seeds, you want your crop to be as uniform as possible and resembling the parent as much as possible. So cross-pollination works against you in that respect. So we try and control the cross-pollination or prevent it. And then we'll go through some actual crops and what you can do to save the seeds with them and how to harvest and preserve them. And then I'll finish up with a couple of websites and resources and take some questions. So I'm sure this is familiar to all of you, Pollination 101. Pollination is just the transfer of pollen grains from the male flower structure, which is there on the left. It's called an anther, and it has the pollen that provides the male gametes, and then that gets transferred to the female structure, which is called a pistil. And if fertilization occurs, then you can get seeds forming. So there are two major types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. And what's being shown in the picture there is cross-pollination, although if it's on the same plant, it would still be referred to as self. So you can get pollination occurring in a bunch of different ways. One of them is wind pollination. A lot of our trees and a lot of the grain crops including corn, but wheat and so on are wind pollinated. And unfortunately, a lot of allergens happen that way as well. Insects also work on pollination, and you can also have pollination occurring in a closed flower without intervention from either wind or insect. And pollination can occur within the same flower, so pollen going from the male structure to the female structure inside the same flower, or in different flowers on the same plant, or in different flowers of the same or compatible species on a different plant. And then, just to make things a little bit more complicated, some plants have separate male and female flowers, which may either be on the same plant or a different plant. And again, two different types of pollination for major categories. So we'll talk about those next, self-pollination and cross-pollination. So self-pollination, again, happens in the same flower. And some of our vegetables are very good at self-pollination. They don't need insects to do this. The picture on the right is what happens in a pea or a bean flower. And those flowers have a keel structure that stays closed, and an insect, if it wants to get in, has to force its way in. But the plant is perfectly happy to pollinate itself without that insect. So the cool thing about self-pollinated plants is that they have pretty much homogeneous genetics, which means that they produce plants and seeds that have pretty much the same genetics as the parent and will look like the parent. So if it's a tomato, for example, the tomato that is produced will taste like and look like the parent, and the seed that is produced from that tomato will also be able to be used to produce another tomato that looked like that parent. So those traits then are preserved when plants are self-pollinated. And over time, when you have crossing, or not crossing, but self-pollination going on or controlled crosses, you can actually eliminate most genetic variation, and you have what we call pure seed lines that are established. Now, on the other hand, cross-pollination either can occur between flowers on different plants, and it has a lot of genetic variation going on. And there are various reasons why a plant might evolve to be cross-pollinated, because genetic variation does help a plant be more resilient to changes. But for seed-saving purposes, uncontrolled crosses should be avoided in order to have a more uniform crop and preserving the traits that you want to preserve. So what happens after pollination is ideally that the pollen will fertilize an ovule in the ovary if the pollen is compatible, and generally plants that need cross-pollination, it isn't going to be compatible, so you do need pollen from another plant. And what will happen then is the pollen grain will grow a tube down into that ovary, fertilize the ovule, and then you get seeds forming. But it's important, if you have a fruit that has a lot of seeds, like maybe a squash, that they all get pollinated and fertilized so that the seed production is able to go on. Now, there are a few things that you need to know about this. So in general, these pure lines come from heirlooms and open pollinated crops. So those are going to produce those uniform plants. Again, they've been inbred for a number of generations, and self-pollinated crops also would fall into that category. So those are all really great for seed saving. So exactly what is open pollinated then? That's a variety with stable genetics, little variability, and usually they're grown in fields where they cross and self-pollinate, but because they have little genetic variability, you get plants and seeds that resemble the parents. Now, you can have genetic drift occur, so people who produce these seeds need to pull any non-uniform seeds out or non-uniform plants out every so often. And an heirloom is just an open pollinated crop that's over 50 years old and has those stable genetics. And then self-pollinated, which can include open pollinated, are flowers pollinated using their own pollen and usually not cross-pollinated. So all of the ones on this page, any vegetables that fall into these categories are really easy to save seeds for. Now, on the other hand, hybrids, and you often will see this on seed packets, hybrids are produced by taking those stable, uniform generation plants and crossing them with each other to produce a hybrid that has various desirable characteristics. So if you see F1, that's the first generation seeds produced by this cross-pollinating. And again, these would be produced by pure lines. So it takes a long time to produce a pure line for an F1 hybrid. But once you have that hybrid and you can continue producing that hybrid through controlled pollination, then you can get all kinds of benefits, maybe hybrid vigor, maybe a more productive plant, a disease-resistant plant, and of course, very uniform appearance. So when you buy that packet of seeds that says F1 hybrid, you know pretty much what all those seeds are going to look like and what they're going to taste like because they've got the same traits. However, if you take those hybrids and then try and grow seeds from them, you will not have a uniform crop. So the main disadvantage is that seeds collected from hybrids do not breed true. And actually, sometimes they're even sterile as well. But I would bet that a lot of the vegetable crops that you've grown are F1 hybrids. So here's a list of a few of them that you might have grown. And again, great plants to grow, but not great plants to save seed from because of that genetic variability. So if you're a beginner for seed starting, probably one of the easiest things to do is to work on those plants that are either self-pollinated or open pollinated. So some of the self-pollinated crops are lettuce, beans, peas, and tomatoes. They all have very stable genetics. Now, I should say tomatoes, there is a caveat, heirloom tomatoes, because the heirloom tomatoes have that stable genetics. However, an F1 hybrid tomato, you would not want to save seeds from. So that's the caveat with that. They all have to be open pollinated or heirloom types. And you are still, though, even though they're self-pollinated, you'd still want to make sure, because an insect can get in there and do some pollinating. So you want to control that pollination. And we'll talk about how to do that. Now, these are some crops that are cross-pollinated. Now, you can control the pollination if it's from an open pollinated variety. You can control it so that you can save those seeds. But in general, these are a lot harder. So you probably would want to start as a new seed saver with some of the other ones that I talked about. So what do you do to control pollination? So we've talked about what pollination is. So what you need to stop from happening is insects or wind getting in there and pollinating the plant when you don't want it to. So you can actually do the pollination yourself, transfer that pollen with a little paintbrush from the male structures to the female structures. Now, if it is, for example, a squash that needs to have some ideally cross-pollination, because you're not crossing it with another squash, but you're only using flowers on the same plant, you would want to, try and for some of the, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, that squash have male and female flowers. So you might want to vary which male flowers you're pollinating the female flowers with. But for a plant that has both the male and female parts, that's pretty easy to do with your little paintbrush. Another thing that you can do is you can try and prevent cross-pollination by only growing one variety of crop. Like, okay, I'm going to save seeds from a tomato. I'm only growing one type of tomato, or I'm only growing one type of bean or pea or lettuce or what have you. The other thing you can try and do if you have a larger property is put distance between varieties. Now, I have a very small urban property. I can't put 300, 500, half a mile between my different types of lettuces. So I don't usually save seed for my lettuces, but I do only grow usually one type of tomato. So if I wanted to save seed, I would be able to do that with using distance. Okay, so now we'll go into some specific crops and what to do with them. So beans are, again, usually self-pollinated: beans, peas, lettuce, and heirloom tomatoes. So usually they don't cross, not something you usually have to worry about. Still, if you want to be absolutely safe, you could separate the varieties by 150 feet, or you could bag the flowers. Now, you can get those mesh bags a lot of places online. Different companies sell them. Seed Savers Exchange sells some of them. And, depending on how much seed saving you want to do and how handy you are, you might want to just order fabric, and it could even be floating row cover, although usually we like to have a bit of a finer mesh where you can get better air circulation. But you could make your own bags if you wanted to. So with the beans, let's say you're only growing one variety of beans. In that case, you wouldn't have to separate, you wouldn't have to bag, and you should be able to allow those pods to mature, which means that they go past being green, the seeds get really large, the pods will get kind of brown and almost woody. So at that point, the seeds are mature. If you were to try and harvest seeds at the same stage that you eat beans, because we usually don't harvest the beans for eating when the seeds are mature, you wouldn't likely get a whole lot of seeds to germinate because they're not done maturing yet. So you definitely want to let the seeds mature, pull the plant up, or harvest the pods until they're dry. And any kind of seed saving should be done in a cool, dry environment. When the seeds are dry and you're storing them, make sure you have them someplace cool and dry and out of sun. So depending on the type of seed, they will last for different amounts of time. And I do have some resources that I can share later that will get you to information about how long different crops will store. Now, peas are pretty much the same treatment as beans. Ideally, you'd have different varieties of peas separated or have another crop flowering at the same time in between. Or you would have varieties that flower at different times. And again, with these self-pollinated crops, cross-pollination is fairly rare. So again, you're going to allow the pods to dry up and brown, and then you can remove the pods and the seeds, allow them to dry before putting them in envelopes or jars. And those are viable for about 3 years. Now, here's a complicated one. This is not a self-pollinated plant. So cucurbits would include crops like all of your vine crops, cucumbers and melons and summer and winter squash. Now, because they are cross-pollinated and you get highly variable seed, and to make things a little more difficult, you have both male and female flowers. There are different things you need to do. So sometimes people ask me, I don't know why I didn't have any fruits forming on my squash or maybe my cucumbers. And what can happen is the temperature affects what sex of flowers you have. So early in the season, you should get male flowers only. Mid-season, you get males and females. And then later season, you get just males again. So the female flowers are always going to have this, what looks like an immature fruit underneath the flower. It may be elongated if it's for a zucchini, squash. It may look like a slightly different shape, but the male flower will have no kind of swelling on it. So what you need to do for cucurbits is before the bees or other insects get to it is you make that cross yourself with your little paintbrush. And you then bag up those female flowers so that nothing else can get to them. And it's the same with cucumbers and so on. Now, there is a little bit of difference in when you harvest. Cucumbers should be harvested after the fruit has matured. It becomes kind of yellowish and hard, but if you let it sit for too long, it will actually ferment, and you want to avoid that for cucumbers. So you may have to experiment with that a little bit, but when you pull it off the vine, you can split it, rinse off the seeds, and lay them out to dry. That's fairly easy for cucumbers. And with the squash, it's similar in that you're going to let that squash get really super mature. One thing to think about is that different kinds of squash will or won't cross with each other. So you can see there are 3 species. They cross within species, but not between species. So your butternut squash will not pollinate your acorn squash, for example. So you could have both of those varieties growing if you wanted 2 different kinds of squash, because they're not going to pollinate each other. How do you know when the squash is ripe? For winter squash and pumpkins, the outer skin will get hard enough that if you poke it with your fingernail, not super hard, but you should not be able to dent it, and that means that it's ripe. And when you open it up, a lot of the innards, instead of being really moist, will be a lot more spongy. But you can scoop out that seed, wash off the pulp, and then spread it out to dry. So that's not too hard either. Now with zucchini, there's an extra step, because the seeds actually, it's a good idea for them to ferment because it helps to enhance germination. So you can see here, you wait until it's really super big and almost woody, and then you take out those seeds and you kind of pound them into, well, you carefully put them into a mash, and then add a little bit of water, put in a closed jar, allow them to sit for a couple days, stirring a few times so that you don't get mold. It is not going to smell wonderful, but by the end of that time, you should be able to kind of make a slurry and add some extra water so the heaviest seeds sink to the bottom, pour off the stuff at the top and any floating seeds. Do that a couple of times until your seeds are fairly clean. Then empty them into a sieve and rinse them to make sure you get off any more goo, and then put them on a screen to dry for a few days. And that should be your zucchinis. Moving on to peppers, they're self-pollinating. You should still bag them though. And the reason for that is that the gene for hotness is dominant. So if you have hot peppers and sweet peppers, if there's any cross-pollination, your sweet peppers are going to produce plants that produce seeds that you then grow out, and oh my, they're hot instead of sweet. So you want to avoid that. And lettuce, also self-pollinating. You can bag those if you want, or you can try and separate them. This is what the seed looks like when it's maturing, when it just starts to get a bit fluffy like this. It may not be purple, may be more green, but you can see the fluff is starting. So at that point, you want to take off those bags, cut off the seed stalks and put them into paper bags, and then wait a little while, and the seeds should continue to ripen and fall off those stalks. And then you still want to let them ripen or dry a little bit longer before storing them. Tomatoes are probably one of the least pleasant to save seeds for, because there's more fermenting involved. If they have a long stigma on the flower, you can just see it sticking out there, then particularly you need to make sure that you bag them so that they don't get cross-pollinated. So here's what the flower looks like. Here's the stigma that's not sticking out, because the male parts would be covering it on this flower. But if you do have one that's sticking out, then make sure to bag. So you make sure that you're picking from ripe and non-damaged fruits. Scoop out those seeds in a container. You label the container, you let it sit for 2 to 3 days, making sure to stir every once in a while. Hopefully you don't get mold forming. And then you do the same thing that you did with the zucchini, where you add a bunch of extra water, let the viable seeds settle, pour off the top a few times until you get rid of all the gel and other garbage, and then you put it into a sieve, rinse it again, and you should have mostly viable seeds at the bottom. So then you can put it on a screen or possibly newspaper to continue to dry. Okay, and so that's all we have time to cover, but I do want to tell you about some really great resources. The first one is Seed Savers Exchange. They're a nonprofit. They have a chart on saving seeds that goes into what you need to do for each crop, and also how to harvest and so on. Johnny's Selected Seeds also has great information, and they have some webinars. Now that site is a little bit more advanced because most of that material is for growers. And then the Seed Alliance has great information too, and there's even a book, the Plant Propagators Bible, which you might want to take a look at. So in summary, know how your crop is pollinated and be prepared to prevent that cross-pollination, either with bags or distancing or timing or what have you. Know when your crop is mature and how and when to harvest it, and have fun. So I'll take any questions now.
All right, thanks, Lisa. A lot of great information there. We do have a few questions here for you. So let's start with this one. Would you advise freezing to extend the period of viability for the seeds?
A lot of times we don't recommend that. There are some seeds that should be stored at certain temperatures, and some can take colder temperatures than others, but generally 35 is the lowest that you'd want to go. So you don't actually want them to freeze.
Okay, it's good to know. Here's a question about distance, sort of. Does isolation and distance really matter if you have your own beehive? Or is that just an indicator that you need to use bags?
The more bees that you have, the more likely cross-pollination is to occur even on self-pollinated plants. So I'd say yes, you definitely are going to need to use bags in that case.
Good advice. So this person has a small urban garden with about 5 varieties of heirloom tomatoes.
Okay.
They're wondering if, can you heir me?
Yeah.
Did you get my question?
Yeah. Yeah, I see the question. So small patch of heirloom tomatoes, different varieties. If I'm understanding you, unless I bag the flowers, any seeds I save will not be true seeds. So again, heirloom tomatoes are mostly self-pollinating, but especially if you have them close together and you have bees, then yes, there is definitely a risk of cross-pollination occurring and things not coming true from seeds. So I would bag then just to be safe. And, you don't need to necessarily bag the whole plant. You can, just bag a cluster or two. And for things like the squash that produce, 200 seeds, you may only need to bag 1 or 2 flowers. So you don't need to go absolutely crazy with it. Okay, and Tim, if you're talking to us, I can't hear you. So let's see here. Looks like I'm not seeing any other questions.
I can jump in, Lisa. There are several questions too. I think we just lost Tim due to some technology, so thanks for bearing with us, everybody. I will point out that in the chat there is a link to a survey for you to fill out. We would love to hear your feedback. I will ask another question that's been getting voted up about using desiccant when storing seeds. Should you use a desiccant?
You shouldn't need to do that necessarily. If you've done a good job of drying the seeds, you don't want them to get, super dry. You want them to be once you've dried them well, you want them to be in a closed container that doesn't get a lot of air circulation because, you don't want to over dry them. So I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lisa, for sharing your knowledge today. And thank you, everybody, for participating and asking your questions. We are sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we will post the link to this recording and a link to Lisa's slides so that you will have those and all the great information she presented. So thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.